Hi, everyone in U.S. History 2. I know many of you were in my U.S. History 1 class from the previous semester, but some of you weren't. Generally speaking, because we are in an online environment, I still like to put something up there to connect with the students besides written summaries or links to good YouTube videos that summarize some of the content in the chapter. Sometimes I think we can have an asynchronous dialogue where I basically, you know, summarize some of the things I thought were critical from the different chapters that we're going to review. We're on chapter 16, and the reason why it's chapter 16, I'm using the same authors from U.S. History 1 to U.S. History 2. You don't have to take U.S. History 1 to take U.S. History 2. It's a chronological cutoff date is really what it is, and it starts. Some classes for U.S. History 2 start with Reconstruction, others start after Reconstruction. This course starts after Reconstruction. And those of you that, just by way of quick recap, Reconstruction is just what it sounds like. It's reconstructing the nation after the Civil War, bringing the southern states back into the Union and creating a semblance of nation. And basically changing the structure of our government in recognition of the things that happened in the Civil War. 13th Amendment, ending um, slavery. The 14th Amendment basically uh, federalizing much more of the nation in that the states can no longer deprive its citizens of certain fundamental rights and equal protection of the laws. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment banned states from discriminating against African American males in voting. We know there's still discrimination against women and other groups until much later in our nation's history, but that's the big process of Reconstruction. And we know there was some initial successes, then later some failures, because once the federal troops and the Freedmen's Bureau left the South, we know that many Jim Crow laws and other acts of segregation really created a second class citizenship for African Americans in the South for some time to come until the 1960s. Really, civil rights movement came into play and other Supreme Court decisions that were ultimately enforced by the courts and then by the federal government itself. But chapter 16, I think it's a great chapter. I like the chapter. Most of you are not in this class because you like history. Many of you are, but there's a lot of you take this class because it fills a requirement in your other degree program, or it fits your schedule and you need 3 credits that will help you to graduate. I get that. A lot of people don't like history. I love history. And if you can't tell, this is my home office. I'm a political junkie, historical uh, I don't know what you would call it, hobbyist. I love this stuff, and I know that makes me a nerd, but I'm fascinated with it, and I'm also fascinated with capital and labor. Probably the most boring chapter for most of you. I have to acknowledge that. But let's just do a quick summary. I'll get it up there. We are after roughly into the 18, in the last quarter, if you will, of the 19th century, the 1870s, 1880s, and we're talking about how basically the Industrial Revolution takes place, and we create these robber barons, these extremely wealthy industrialists who basically change the nature in which manufacturing and technology reshape not only the American economy, but also reshape the social structure of our nation. Some would say for the benefit or for the better, and some others would say for the great detriment of everyday people. Obviously, there's a gradient scale there. It obviously improved our country's national wealth by leaps and bounds. In fact, we went from, and I'm not always so keen on specific dates, but the one that I thought was really kind of salient or important, it said basically Britain, Germany, and France were all ahead of us in the 1860s. Just at the end of the Civil War. But by 1900, the United States was the world's leading manufacturing nation. By 1913, just talk about how rapidly this occurs. By 1913, not only were we ahead of Great Britain, France, um, um, and Germany, we were ahead of them combined. That's how rapid the industrial growth occurs. And they talk about this dichotomy that we create in American culture of some very super rich people and certainly growth of the middle class as well, which I think all of us welcome. But the sad part was it also created a huge laboring class as well as detriment to the agrarian part of our country, farmers. Farmers really took a huge blow economically during the last quarter of the 19th century. Their commodity prices, prices of food products that they produced, and animal products as well, dropped dramatically, but yet the cost of transportation and farming actually rose. So their economic standing actually diminished, and many people lost their family farms during this era. And those that didn't struggled and went backwards, as did many laborers. Skilled labor was no longer nearly as significant as industrialization made work much more piecemeal, and once you could be trained on doing one thing, you became interchangeable as a laborer, but so did the efficiency of the sort of the mass scale of production that really changed during this era. So as a result of this dichotomy, the wealthy, the investors, the owners becoming extremely wealthy, but the laborers really doing quite poorly. Many of them worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week and went even further backwards as the cost of living rose. So they were falling backwards, but they were the backbone basically of the profit. And so tensions rose. And like anything else, when you feel like you're getting kind of the short end of the stick, what do? You try to find a way to fight back. And some of it's through violence, but most of it was through organized labor. And we know the first big union were the Knights of Labor, and they had too broad a social agenda. They weren't just bread and butter issues about better pay and the shorter workday. They were much more thinking much more globally to change society into a sort of labor focused power structure. And that ended up backfiring. They become, although they get big very quickly, and there's this huge strike, largely railroad strike in 1877. It was how many people actually died in this thing. It was quite large. Yeah, 100 Americans actually died during the great upheaval of the railroad strike. Other industries actually joined the railroad strikers in solidarity, and a lot of them were broken by local municipalities, militias, vigilantes. They were also broken by a private group called Pinkerton Detectives. They were just like basically hired by these wealthy robber barons to break the strikes. Those weren't the things that really broke the back of the labor unions in that era. It's actually the federal government. The government is what came down and actually broke. The government worked hand in hand with industry to break labor's back. And it didn't break it completely, because we know labor will have some great successes in the future. But for a period of time, industry was backed up by government, and there's no question about it. Courts, police, state militias suppressed the strikes, but it was the federal troops that finally defeated them. And we know as capital grows and as industry grows, eventually labor unions are going to get stronger and stronger as well too. And we'll talk about in later chapters some of the laws that came down that actually hurt labor and eventually benefited labor later on. One of the great things that the book does discuss, and you should know it just as a basic citizen, is part of the success of the robber barons came about as a result of the recognition of the corporate charter. Prior to this era, pre-Civil War, say, for example, corporations were really only designed for public use. Things like, to run a municipality, to run a municipal canal system or something like that, or to run a town. Sometimes you go into a town and see, the town of Sandwich, Massachusetts, incorporated in such a day. But then later states, as a result of some reforms after the Civil War, states were handing out corporate charters to private entities, businesses. And what the big change there was it allowed the pooling of capital. People who had a little bit of money, not necessarily the richest people in the world, they could pool their money with other people and invest without risk that your personal home or other assets could be lost as a result of legal liability or failure of the business. The only thing you would lose was your initial investment. And this really pumped huge amounts of money into industry. And some industries grew and died, others waffled in between, but overall, the industrial America grew so rapidly. It's really remarkable. It's the Industrial Revolution. But we know it created what? A dichotomy in our society. No longer were we a bunch of, for the most part, middle-class people. There was an extremely small amount of super wealthy people. There was a growing middle class, but the biggest class that grew most of all were the working poor, both in the agricultural level and in the industrial level. Skilled labor started to becoming less significant, meaning real artisans that were skilled at multifaceted aspects of industry were no longer needed. You'd be trained in one aspect of making one part. Instead of having 30 craftsmen make a machine, 30 machines, you'd have 30 different specifically quasi-labor, skilled labor, working on one part. So the individual laborers were interchangeable, just like the parts were. And machinery became much more universally patent scripted. Basically, the parts were interchangeable. They just kept forming the same part over and over again. It wasn't like each machine was unique. It would be the same model with the same, interchangeable parts from one model to the other. And that really, really changed manufacturing. In fact, I think there was a good example on one of the reapers, these farm pieces of machinery that were developed. Yeah, it says right here, it said in 1880, they produced 21,000 machines. In 1885, as a result of this industrialization and mass production of units, they made twice as many in 1885. So 5-year span doubles 100%. But look what they did in another 4 years. So it's less than a decade in time from producing 21,000 to over 100,000 machines during that same time period. The cost of production started going way down. Profits kept going way up. And does that get dispersed to everyone? No, it gets just dispersed to the owners, which are a very small amount of the population of society. And so the legal creations called the corporation, you know them well to this day. Some of you might even invest in them. I invested a little bit of money in corporations as well. I know I could lose everything, but the reality is I don't put any labor into that. I don't make anything. The money arguably makes more money, and that's how the rich stay rich and the poor can't get in there as well. Although we have an American belief system, there's no question about it, that we believe we can all get ahead someday and we can be the robber barons and success stories, even though statistically that's unlikely to happen. But during this era, I think there's a great quote in here talking about the different, how much wealth gets really put into small groups. And here it is right here. It says, according to various measurements, and these are ballpark, but they're pretty, they're pretty solid in terms of giving you a snapshot of what it was like at the turn of the century going into the 1900s. In 1890, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned 1/4 of the nation's assets. 25% of the assets are owned by 1%. But then the top 10% of the population owns 70% of Americans' wealth. And then by 1900, the wealthiest, richest 10% controlled 90% of the nation's wealth. We're very top heavy. And that's a real, arguably a tragedy if you're like me, although I'm doing pretty well now, but I'm freaking old. I've worked a long time. I worked 2 full-time jobs. I still practice law full-time pretty much. I have this teaching job. I went to school forever to get ahead. And it was, it was a pain in the ass, but I'm doing all right. But let's face it, some people toil day in and day out, and they work really very, very hard, and they're very industrious, but they don't get ahead. And that's still an undercurrent theme in American politics, history, and tensions that are occurring. How do we make it more equitable? Or should we make it more equitable? And that's one of the theories that develops during this period of time based upon social Darwinism, which I think I'm about to get to. I just kind of want to follow along what I'm doing in the book. Yeah, here it is right here. We know Charles Darwin created this origin of species that, different animals and organisms would either thrive because they were the strongest and healthiest, those that were weak or their attributes that were weak or inefficient would fade away, and the strong would survive, or the strongest aspects of the organism would only grow and improve. The weakest aspects would be thrown out. That was a very popular scientific view in the late 1800s, but it got adopted into social thought in sociology. And there were professors at Harvard and Yale and everywhere out through the country, and newspaper people that propagate this concept that, and here Herbert Spencer is one of the most famous, popularized the phrase survival of the fittest, and according to Spencer, demonstrated their superiority through economic success, and that state welfare, charity, all of those things actually led to social degeneration. How? Because it encouraged the survival of the weakest, and that's nothing we should do. Now, the wealthiest of Americans and those that are thriving and successful and their world is wonderful, social Darwinism is a very popular philosophy. But others, especially those that have a kind of a moral code and maybe some religious teachings or some religious values or maybe just moral values, recognize that sometimes the wealth of a nation and the wealth of a people and the wealth of a society is measured by how we help those who are less fortunate and maybe those who don't have the same gifts or opportunities that others do, and not necessarily creating an equal society, but egalitarian or equitable society. I'm big in this philosophy because I don't think we all should be equal, but I think we should have equal opportunity, and those that can't really compete with others should still have a very important place at the table, for lack of a better way of saying it. I'm not a socialist or anything like that, but I'm certainly not a believer in social Darwinism, where if you're weak and you can't make ends meet, you should just rot in the corner and die off. I think that was outrageous, but it was very popular in this era. It was incredibly popular. We moved away from that as a society for the most part, but there's still some people that believe it. Hey, if you can't make it, get out of the way. Too bad. And I shouldn't pay for you to have housing and food and everything else with my tax dollars. It's not appropriate. There's that philosophy that still exists to this day. So you should know about social Darwinism and Darwinism created. And I love this sentence because I very rarely underline things in a book because of the way my mind works. But this one I thought was so newspaper people, books, the society was really trying to push this concept, but it backfired because people say, wait, this is ridiculous. But some in society, especially those doing well, believe this. The inequity of outcomes was not to be merely tolerated, but encouraged and celebrated during this era. We should applaud those that are thriving and doing well, and we should kind of condemn those that are doing poorly. It's their own damn fault. They're not smart enough. They're not good enough. They're not working hard enough. And we prove it by their failure. And that was the value system we had at this period of time, with many in power. And you got to remember, who's going to control the government? And I don't want to really sit and believe this, but do people with power and wealth and assets help control what government goals and relationships will be? Well, sure. And so therefore, government arguably is supportive of these concepts. And of course, then things started to, and most of the government was pro-business during this era. So Spencer's social Darwinism provided a moral justification for the national policies that minimized government interference in the economy, other than the protection of business. What an irony. But then obviously there's a backlash because the great majority of people were struggling. And so the labor movement develops. And I already talked about the Knights of Labor and the different labor organizations that came out. We know there was a failure in 1877, but the push started there and on the Great Railroad Strike, that great upheaval. But there were others that developed more and more. The Knights of Labor was the first big organization. It ultimately failed, but for a while, it still had a ripple effect throughout society. And my favorite is they allowed anybody into the union. In terms of workers, they could be unskilled or skilled, including women. And there's always a race issue in the South, but multiple races were even allowed into the Knights of Labor. And I always make the argument in later part of American history that the labor movement in the 1950s and 60s actually helped break some of the barriers in race. They're not broken entirely. We know there's a lot of racial issues we still have in our country, but I always thought labor unions later, not earlier, because they had strife with it in the earlier times. But here's what I like about what the Knights of Labor, the only group they banned as members are lawyers. No lawyers allowed. No, I'm a lawyer, so I find it kind of funny. The hatred of lawyers has always been in history. Bankers, that's okay. And liquor dealers, because we're starting the temperate movement. Doesn't just come up in the late 19 teens, if you will. The temperance movement has been around for hundreds of years, and it was considered to be sort of a less than moral industry to be involved in during that time frame. So the Knights of Labor pushed really hard for the 8-hour day. I'm involved in some labor stuff, and I know some people hate labor unions. That's fine. You're entitled to the philosophy. But one of the bumper stickers I have, I don't have it in my car right now, I have in my other car, is that if you like an 8-hour day and if you like having the weekend off, thank a labor union. Because there's some truth to that. They advocated for that way back in the late 1800s. They fought like hell. They didn't get it then, but over time, the message and the movement brought us to the 8-hour day. Not because the unions didn't enforce it. It was the unions pressuring politicians, and politicians ultimately adopted it in most labor contracts. And then we know one of the things that backfired on the unions were often portrayed by powerful newspaper people, by government, by the wealthy robber barons as radical. And they were radical, and they were negative, and they were often viewed that way because when labor unions fought back against tyranny and violence against themselves, they would often destroy property, and that's what the news coverage would often entail. So you're kind of getting one side of the story, and it made labor unions look very bad. And then, of course, we know about the big Haymarket fiasco. I believe it's right outside of Chicago, in these The union members were striking there. They were in the Haymarket Square protesting. Police were breaking it up, basically busting heads with billy clubs. But somebody threw a bomb into the crowd or to the crowd of policemen. 7 policemen were killed. That's all the press really sensationalized, and the nation became outraged. And who are they outraged at? Well, they're outraged at the union. And as a result of that, the Knights of Labor as a union organization went from very high membership and great power to basically utter collapse overnight because of the Haymarket Square bombing. What grew out of that? Well, we know the AFL. Later, the AFL will join the CIO. I believe they've broken up again recently, but the AFL is more of a trade union of skilled workers. They look for more what I call bread and butter, pure, simple trade unionism. Safer conditions, better pay, fewer hours, and they were a more conservative group, and they were viewed as less radical. And they had some fairly decent success, and they're still around to this day, the AFL. My dad was a member of the AFL for a long time. We know that different strikes developed during this time, and the strikes are always broken by whom? A lot of people think they're broken by the employer. Well, the employer with the assistance of the federal and often state governments. Some state governments wouldn't help because they were sympathetic to the union goals. But the federal government, President Grover Cleveland, broke one of the strikes over the Pullman rail cars, and a guy by the name of Eugene Debs was a great leader, labor leader. He's one of my favorite political characters because he ran for president while serving jail time when he was opposed to World War I, and his campaign was something, vote Eugene Debs, inmate number, and that was what his pin would say, vote inmate number such and such. He's quite a character in history, but he got, as a result of getting arrested because of the breaking of the union by the federal militia or military, he became very embittered, and he ultimately leaves sort of traditional union activity. He becomes initially a socialist, which in that era wasn't a dirty word, but then later he becomes a communist. And unfortunately for him, he argues against things like the World War I and other activities because he says it's just to help big businesses, help the industrialists and the rich, and that's all it's really for. And that kind of seditious behavior back then, even though you would think it would be free speech, it wasn't. He got a long federal sentence for sedition, and that's when he ran for politics from them. But we know the socialist movement and these liberal, arguably radical movements get viewed by the American people often very darkly after the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Red Scare. The Red Scare gets affiliated with labor unrest, and it's hard to shake it for a lot of unions, and certainly Eugene Debs loses his popularity. But for a period of time, he ran for president one time before he got arrested. I don't see where the first one was, but he got quite a few votes at one time. But then the populist movement was derived mostly from farmers and agrarian workers, which made up the great bulk of our nation anyways. So the agrarian workers are getting really upset. The capitalists, the bankers, the northern middlemen, they're all making all the great money. Farmers are feeding the nation, and they're getting screwed. And the Democratic Party doesn't seem to be nearly as responsive enough to them. The Republican Party seems to be in the pocket of big business. And so what do? They start creating their own political allegiances, and it becomes known as the People's Party, or later known as the Populists. And it's pretty darn popular. It's the most significant third-party political movement we've ever had in our nation for a sustained duration. For a little while, there was something called the Progressive Party, which was Teddy Roosevelt for really one election cycle. But we had the Populist Party, and they were huge. They were almost televangelistic in their terms of their outlook, preaching for the common farmer as opposed to the big business. And the common farmer was the agrarian myth, right? These people are more moral, more wholesome, and more American than the rest, and they should have their due rights protected. And they got a lot of senators, a lot of Congress members elected, a lot of governors, especially the southern and rural states. And the movement was most significant in those agrarian communities, but it was also pretty significant with some laborers, like everyday laborers, started recognizing the populist movement as their cause too. It became very, very popular. And the one that in the party does get absorbed a bit by the Democratic Party later. It couldn't stay independent. And one of the great candidates, and he's one of my favorite political characters, and I'm going to turn around and see my giant bald spot in the back here. I don't know if I have any Eugene Debs. Yes, I do. I have him right up here. I was going to stand up, but I'm only wearing gym trunks underneath. I only dress up from the top up when I do these videos. But I have several of William Jennings Bryan's political buttons, because the guy was like an unbelievable orator during his time, and he basically had the populist message, but he was doing it within the Democratic Party. And in fact, when the populists nominated, not the first time, but the second election, I think it's in 1900, when they wanted to nominate a presidential candidate, the Democratic Party nominated William Jennings Bryan again, but so did the Populist Party, and it was called political fusion. But what did it ultimately result in? The populists started breaking apart, some of them going to the socialist movement, some of them going to the Democratic Party, and others just splintering. And in the South, part of the splintering was over race because many African American farmers wanted to join, and they did. They created their own units of the populist alliances in the agrarian alliances, and other white farmers, some would deal with them, others wouldn't, and it helped fracture the populist movement in the southern region. Race remained a very difficult legacy in the South in terms of creating unified goals for economic gain. It's really quite sad. So the farmer alliances come together, and the populist movement, we know about the Omaha platform, sought to counter large-scale power of monopolistic capitalism with strong, engaged in modern federal government that backed the farmers. And that was the quote. They wanted them to take over the trains. Trains shouldn't be run by business people. It should be run by the government. So should the telegraph. So should the post office. And the post office should be a place where farmers could get credit. And there should be big warehouses where they could store their goods or their product until prices came up. And so the government shouldn't work hand in hand with capitalists. It should work hand in hand with farmers. And it really caught on. It was a very, very powerful political movement. A lot of people thought it might well take over if it wasn't for the Democratic juggernaut of William Jennings Bryan. The populists might have stayed on course as an independent third party platform for a while, but the Democrats, the Democratic Party, became a big tent party and adopted many of the populist views later and weakened the populist argument. But William Jennings Bryan was a guy that thought that monetary policy was a big part of inflating the commodities, helping the farmers make more money or having their products worth more. And so we get off the gold standard and go on to a silver standard because silver was much more plentiful and it would inflate prices. It was the belief. I'm not quite always sure I understand it, even though I studied the gold standard quite a bit, because William Jennings Bryan gave this unbelievable speech at the Democratic Convention. He wasn't even considered a front runner at the time, but he basically said, we will not be sacrificed on a cross of gold. But the lead up to that conclusion in the speech was so moving that people were weeping in the audience, and they were so spellbound by this guy that he got nominated by popular acclaim. And that I read that speech many times. It's one of my favorites, and it was basically, we won't be crucified on a cross of gold. Us farmers, us working people, us everyday folks, and we're against the bankers and the money makers and the robber barons, and we're going to have some success. And he nearly pulled it off. The reason why he didn't was McKinley ran on the gold standard. He was pro-business, but he also outspent because all the robber barons backed him. And I'm a big believer that money does help get you elected. And if you look, McKinley wasn't a nut or anything like that. He wasn't ultra pro-business, but he was pro-business enough that the economy of America was very important. To be pro-business was sound economic policy. But he also did what? He also outspent, let me see here, I got it right here. The pro-business Republican outspent McKinley's Bryan fivefold, 5 times as much. So for every dollar that William Jennings Bryan was able to put together, McKinley could put 5 times as much. We know McKinley had a short presidency because he was ultimately assassinated. But if you study the robber barons and the history of these great men that did the railroads, the gold, the steel industry, the oil, the rails that were still successful because most of the rails went bankrupt. But these very, very wealthy people basically did everything they could to make sure McKinley got elected. And William Jennings Bryan, he ran 3 times for president. He was a Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He had a huge political career. Unfortunately, near the end of his life, he really screwed up. I think he screwed up. He also became a very, nothing wrong with religion, but he was an anti-evolution candidate because he was anti-Darwinist policy, and so in terms of how society looks, people are all equal under God's creation. And there was a famous story called the Scopes Monkey Trial, which I always love to talk about because my favorite attorney, a guy by the name of Clarence Darrow, defended the teacher down in Tennessee who taught evolution. I got charged. He was going to do a short jail sentence as a result. So Clarence Darrow defended Scopes at that trial. But William Jennings Bryan testified for the prosecution in terms of the Bible's literal meaning. And he unfortunately came in very cocky and self-assured that he was an expert in the Bible. And Clarence Darrow made him look very, very foolish and kind of humiliated him. And he did very poorly. Although the prosecution was able to convict Scopes, Clarence Darrow lost the case, but he revealed the law and the practice of prosecuting someone for teaching evolution as being a bit narrow-minded and parochial. And just a few days after the trial, William Jennings Bryan passed away. A lot of people thought of a broken heart from being humiliated in the trial. But he's one of my favorites in history. Now we know the socialists, really the communists later, the Socialist Party. Ultimately, Eugene Debs becomes in the front of that. Membership was open to everybody. Didn't matter if you're a man, a woman, didn't matter your race, your ethnicity. You could be a member of the party. So you can imagine it drawing a lot of the underclass, which was huge during this time, into its popular views. Early immigrants often joined the Socialist Party. They didn't have the dirty name they have now. If you call somebody a socialist even today in America, there's a sort of a visceral reaction that they must be evil. But at that time, they weren't. And they created something called the Industrial Workers of the World, very popular. I listened to folk music from that era, and many of the songs about union activity talked about the industrial workers of the world and how we were, basically we're toiling to make rich people richer, and the poor people do all the creation, but yet we get none of the benefit. And it was a very popular mythology during that period of time, and Eugene Debs led that. As the leader, he became a little too radicalized, though. But we look at the time, some of the great Americans that we think of, even today, we think of the great, were members of the Socialist Party in this era. Helen Keller, Upton Sinclair, the great writer, Jack London, also another great writer. They all became socialists. It was very, very popular at that time. And they were all often related to different labor industries, and some of the disaffected populists also joined the Socialist Party. And if you look at 1912, the Socialist Party candidate for president received almost 6% of the total vote. That's remarkable. I mean, we don't even get libertarians getting the vote or other third-party candidates to this day. But we know as a result, and I wish the book did a better job on it, although the book's not getting into that. But socialism dies as it becomes, I should say dies, but becomes less effectual in our society's viewpoint, because it gets deemed to be looked at as undermining American values. And after the Russian Revolution, it definitely gets that connotation. The Red Scare is still with us today, I think, on some level. Good chapter. It's a great book. I love it. I know some of you find it dry, but I promise I'd put something up. I was hoping to go 15 minutes. I went 32. I'm sorry. But I know I cover a lot of stuff quick. Sometimes I forget very important things. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions about the chapter. If you want more insight, if I have it, or if I can find it for you, I'd be glad to help. Otherwise, be well. And welcome aboard.